Well, hello everyone. My name is James Lyne, and I'm the CTIO at SANS Institute. And I'm here today with the wonderful Jeff Pollard from Forrester. Now, Jeff, if you haven't run into him before, which is unlikely given he's pretty prolific, he's a VP, a Principal Analyst at Forrester. And I'm pleased to have him here because he leads Forrester's research on the role of the CISO, specializing in things like security, strategy, budgets, metrics, business cases, presenting to the board, something I know lots of security leaders struggle with. He's got a background in a ton of different companies. He's been in security, defense, media, telcos. So he brings a really broad perspective. He's also got a really active role in Forrester's kind of forward-looking research on security innovation, which is something we are bound to be touching on here today. So, Jeff, a pleasure to have you to have you join us today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
Super. So look, you and I both spend a lot of time talking to security leaders about the problems of the here and now. We've got AI, zero trust, human errors, new privacy issues, deep fakes, regulations, reporting to the board, you name it. And I'm sure we're going to touch on most of those in this session today. But before we get started, I want to pick your brains on just the state of being for security leaders and just test out an idea that I've been thinking about. I always think of security leaders as being under this kind of pressure vice of different trends and different requirements, technology, business, threat, regulation, kind of responding to all these different sides. And I have this hypothesis that here and now security leaders are a little more under pressure to deal with these trends, the kind of onslaught of AI and similar, than ever before, but with a pretty similar resource profile. So before we get stuck into AI and anything bigger, talk to me about what you're hearing from security leaders about the pressures of here and now. Is it worse than usual, or is it just another year?
I think it's definitely worse than usual. I sort of say it this way. It's never been a better time to be a security leader, but it's also never been a worse time to be a security leader. It's a better time for a lot of valid reasons. A lot of them you mentioned, right? All of these burdens, all these things we're dealing with. We're now at the point in the world where people are finally aware of what CISOs have tried to do for the past 20 or 30 years, which is make people care about security. I often say that, the minute that phones being hacked or something like that was on TMZ as like the lead story, we were cool. Our industry was cool. Now, your significant other may not think you're cool. Your kids certainly won't think you're cool, but we were cool. So you tell them that.
We think people are cool, right?
Absolutely,
Jeff? That's all
think
that
we're cool.
matters.
Yeah, and that is really all that matters, right? We tell the jokes for ourselves. But so it's awesome that happened. But at the same time, with that visibility, with more CISOs than ever reporting into CEOs, for example, with more regulation than ever that we're experiencing right now, there's also a lot more at risk, right? Including what's happened in the last year or so, a lot more personal risk from a CISO perspective, from a civil and or criminal perspective for leading a security program. And so, yeah, we've got more attention. We've absolutely got more spotlight. We've got more budget, but we also got more challenges that we're facing. And now the stakes of those challenges are much higher than they've ever been before. And I think that's part of why we see a number of CISOs that are exiting the field or leaving and maybe going to a vendor organization because they're saying, look, that personal risk or that personal liability for me or my team, it's not worth it. I'm concerned about it. So again, I think it's definitely worse than it's ever been in terms of the way you mentioned that pressure. There are some positives that come from that, but there's also a lot of downsides. And I think that's why we see CISOs really looking at sort of their options and deciding, do I stay in security? Do I stay in security in the same way? Do I exit and do something else entirely? Because maybe that risk or that liability or the kind of reputational things that can happen just aren't worth it for them.
Yeah, I think that's entirely on point. And I think the glide scope for this is towards more pressure, more liability in general, because technology is becoming a supporting pillar of everything we do in our world, not just business, but all of our lives. Security powers the trust in that technology. Security leaders are at that crucible of, are we doing a good job investing correctly and otherwise? So I think it is a bit of an inflection point for people professionally as this stuff, not just as in the headlines, but now as in the laser focus of businesses for investment and risk, and even the regulators, which we'll come to shortly as well. So, well, hey, let's see if we can help people a little bit. Here, Jeff. I know we're not going to solve world peace or solve all of cybersecurity,
Yeah.
100% security by the end of the webinar. But let's hit on some of the hot topics and share a few of the kind of thoughts from some of the security leaders we've talked to here. I like to start off in AI. Go figure.
Right. Yep.
It's the hot topic of the moment. And look, you've done a lot on AI. I know there's been some great Forrester pieces here on Gen AI and using it responsibly and effectively. And one of the things I know you have kind of outlined that I really love as the eternal voice of reason and pragmatism in this industry, prioritizing usefulness over flashiness.
Yep.
Love that saying. So could you make that a little real for us? Could you give us a practical example of where Gen AI maybe is actually having an impact in cybersecurity operations? It's not just a kind of AI will be important, but it's doing something today. And what made it successful?
Yeah. So I think we've got, one of those things, right, is when we talk AI, we've got to sort of divide it up between predictive AI, which we've had for a long time now, and then generative AI, which is that new hotness, that new buzz. So predictive AI, when you think about that, security is kind of built on it, where there comes to detection, attribution, clustering, threat hunting, any of those things, right? We've got long-standing kind of use cases for AI deployed widely, anti-fraud being one of the most prominent that's either directly in security or kind of security adjacent at a minimum. But when it comes to generative AI in particular, I do think there are some really solid use cases within cybersecurity for the technology. One of my favorites is seeing the sort of impact that generative AI can have on security operations in particular, because I think there's a real win there. When it comes to writing up things like after action reports or incident summaries, it can do a phenomenal job there. Another place that it can save security practitioners time is things like writing queries, learning kind of query languages or the different, kind of capabilities you need to write something in, this query language or that query language. It can do a phenomenal job of accelerating some of those types of things. But I think one of the really important parts that we're getting to there is that for it to really help you do that, you will have to know how to do it already. So it's not going to make a beginner seem like someone that's got 5 to 10 years of experience. What it's going to do is it's going to make your people that have 3, 4, 5 years of experience even better. It's going to help your beginners get better faster, but it's not going to turn someone that's a year in and make them look like someone that's 3 to 5 years in. But it can take your most experienced people and make them a ton more
Jeff,
productive,
if I
which is a
may,
huge savings because that allows them to mentor some of the beginners. Yeah.
I love that point, right? And if I may, to add an extra dimension to why I think you're so right on that, AI is incredible, but there's this predisposition towards hallucinations and to errors. When you take someone who has the skills and the expertise and judgment, and you give them a tool like this, they get the benefits, they manage the downsides. When you take someone who is more junior, there's a risk that they're duped by those hallucinations, right? You can imagine a doctor in a hospital who's been through general medical training kind of goes, hey, that's not part of the treatment plan for that, versus someone who's watched a few YouTube videos and in theory now has access to this expansive knowledge. They go, oh, that's how I treat someone with that illness. And they kind of don't know that treatment protocol is not approved or acceptable or otherwise. So I love the way you think about that, and not to interrupt your flow, carry on, but it makes so much sense.
It's a good point, because one of the things I want to bring up there is like, what's the easiest way to scare yourself? Go on WebMD. No offense to the website, right? But when you type your symptoms into WebMD, you are convinced that everything you have is the worst thing ever. But when you go to a physician, what's that saying they say in medical training, right? It's when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras, right? You probably don't need to see Dr. House because you've got a runny nose, right? It probably doesn't mean what you think it does. And that's exactly what happens here when you take someone that's inexperienced, that's not trained. They don't know when they're kind of going in a direction that they shouldn't go. They don't know when to kind of put on the brakes. And that's why this is so powerful and transformative for a most experienced personnel. But it's not, you can't just unleash this on beginners. But there's another angle to this too, which is where it can help security leaders themselves. In fact, we just released a report on this recently. So when you think about how this can transform security leaders, it can also help them. One of the areas you mentioned, communicating with the board, refining language, thinking about how to communicate. Do I think that, typing a sentence into a a writing assistant of some sort to figure out if maybe you're being too harsh or you're not being persuasive enough or you're not being professional enough. Do I think that's a pretty good idea for a CISO? Yeah, if it doesn't include sensitive data or sensitive information, you should use that. Things like creating PowerPoints, refining slides, creating visualizations. Those things are really good uses for an executive as well. So there's a lot of transformation out there, but it's about how you apply it. Are you going to have a SOC that's full of nothing but robots, right? Is the T900 going to be running your SOC next year? No, we're not going fully autonomous. But should you be exploring this to make everyone you have better? Yeah, absolutely. You'd be silly not to do that.
Yeah, I love, by the way, that report writing, communicating use case, of course, in the right approved tools with the right policies and so on, all that stuff. But I'd say that's one of my top use cases, the explain this for an English second language speaker to remove the overly complex verbose vocabulary that I tend to add to things. The explain this like I'm at a dinner party and I have 2 minutes. You know, building prompts around translating kind of more complex concepts into that stuff is incredibly useful for communicating to broader business leaders.
Those are two great examples.
I love
by
that
the way.
use
I love
case.
those. I'm gonna steal those. I think because that's I
They
like
work.
that's really good. Yeah.
And the dinner party one is nice as well because you can kind of continue the dinner party conversation. Hey, I'm confused about this. What's that mean? And it actually ends up as a kind of a wonderful, prompt narrative on things like kind of incident response. Following on to your latter part there, the kind of the T9000, the Terminator scenario, a lot of this stuff started crazy overhyped. And I'm with you. Like, I think there are going to be incredible benefits here in incident response, forensics, defense, things where there's structured analysis, queries, kind of helping the SOC with insight, translating. I think there'll be a lot of value there. As with a lot of new innovations, we're seeing quicker use cases developing on the offensive side, and the defensive will likely follow. But kind of back to your flashiness and usefulness, this isn't the first time this has happened. I come from a background in antivirus and then became, anti-malware and then EDR. I've seen stuff plastered with AI before. So I think there is this real, how do you evaluate the true utility of the technology, not just the marketing? How do you make sure this thing actually has an impact in your environment? That has got to be high on the agenda for security leaders. And one observation I like to test with you and see what you think. Because AI is so usable, a lot of folks default to, I'll evaluate it by interacting with it, right? The kind of prompt exchanges seems useful. I think we're skipping something we would do with other technologies, which is we make sure we have 2 or 3 people in our team that aren't just power users. They kind of deeply understand the technology behind the technology. When you were testing, firewalls and other things, if you're in a product security testing role, you have people who are deeply technical, executing a test bed against it. And some of that seems to be being skipped over because of how intuitive this stuff is. So I think folks need to think about the skills they need in their team to evaluate AI's utility, not just interact with AI. And I think that's something people can start to plan for now, depending on the size and scale of the company. If you're a slow follower, I appreciate, that's a little bit different. I wonder how you think about that, getting past the marketing and evaluating.
So I think you're 100% right with that. And I think part of the challenge here is because AI is non-deterministic by definition, it's really hard to evaluate. Because the quality of the prompt, the quality of the data, the number of times you're willing to ask, whether or not you're willing to bribe, right? Because we've seen, like, studies have shown, there's data out there that confirms that if I tell in a prompt that do a better job on this and I'll reward you, the prompt will do a better job. Like it's weird.
Or take your time before giving me an answer. And the AI produces a better answer. Like that's an irritating human realism. Don't do that.
We were anthropomorphizing these things, right? But we also know that there are some tips and tricks that works. Also, the moralizing. I get tired of being told that it can't tell me something because it might be unethical. It's like, look, assume that I'm morally gray. give me my answer, please. But all those things
Yes, I
aside,
want to write some malware.
yeah,
Oh, you shouldn't do that. Oh, but
right.
it's for research. Oh, okay.
Then you can, right? Or I'd like to record the keystroke of every single thing that a person types on their computer. It's not malware; it's called recall. But anyway, let's not go there because that's a different animal. But so when
That's a
I think
different
you're right,
animal.
like, that's a whole different problem. Yeah, I think that you're right. When you're evaluating this, it is much more difficult to evaluate because we don't have a ton of experts. It's a brand new technology, and the experience of the technology varies based on a lot of factors. So it's super hard to kind of figure out what this is going to do in your environment, how it's going to enable people, what outcomes it's going to produce, whether it's going to accelerate them or not. There's a learning curve, of course, right? There's the training burden, and all those things, which is absolutely true. And of course, what's happening to a lot of security leaders is that they're being forced to grapple with this because these capabilities are being built into and embedded in the stuff they already own. And sometimes they're not being charged for that. So all of a sudden they went from sort of a generative AI free world to, well, now my SIM has some generative AI, my EDR has some generative AI, my antivirus has some generative AI, my web proxy, like every tool has it, and they're not being charged for it. So teams start to grapple with, is it going to work? What's it going to do for us? And all of this stuff has happened before they were able to really sit down and say, what do I need this for? Like, is this actually making my people better? Is this going to accelerate my IR workflow or my investigative workflow? Is it going to help me write better policies and configurations for technologies? And so that's where I kind of feel bad for CISOs, because it's almost like we skipped that part of the process because vendors in the ecosystem got so excited that they jammed this stuff in. And now you're like, well, I deployed generative AI without buying it, and now they want to charge me more for it. And should I buy that or not? It's a huge conundrum for security teams, and I think we're going to have a lot of situations where there are kind of some false steps with this. But one caution I really do want to give security leaders, because I think in security we have a bias towards cynicism and skepticism. I don't think that's exactly a bold comment or anything, right? It's a psychological disposition given what we do to some extent. But the other part of this
I
too is
represent that remark.
exactly as you would in this industry, right? Exactly. So, but I do think that one of the challenges, right? You've been around a while. I've been around a while. We do get skeptical about technology when it comes around a couple times and it doesn't do anything, right? This is kind of the third or fourth time AI's come around and knocked on the door, and it seems a little bit more real this time. And so, if you
It
are
does.
that cynical sort and you sort of say, well, we've heard this before, AI is not real, you're going to get caught flat footed. Cloud is my example of this. Cloud was not the first time that we had servers hosted by someone else. that wasn't a new
No,
thing,
no, for
but
sure.
cloud, yeah, it's been around, but cloud's like 16, 18 years old now, and some security leaders are still getting caught kind of flat-footed by it because they sort of tuned it out. So the risk here, or the thing that I would stress to security leaders, is make sure that kind of inherent bias of, well, I heard IoT was coming and it took forever, I heard OT was coming and it took forever, I heard cloud was coming and it took forever, don't necessarily apply that to AI right now. Or when you do, you're going to find it in your security program and throughout your enterprise, and then you're going to be scrambling, and that makes you look bad. That makes you look like the
Yeah.
Department of No, or a source of friction. So be really careful that inherent cynicism and the fact that it's been around a bit doesn't color or bias you from recognizing that this time it does seem to be more real than ever.
I agree with that. I think that's a great point. If you stick around in this industry long enough, like you and I have, you'll fail to catch a wave, right? There'll be
Yep.
one you mean to catch, and you'll miss it because
Yep.
of kind of what you're describing. And let me say, whilst I'm cynical, I watched us move from manually writing virus identities for individual pieces of malicious code to an expert system doing kind of framed regressional analysis over huge data sets of petabyte of malware, using machine learning to write, identities for detection that completely changed the ability to detect malicious code on a global scale. That was much more machine learning and data science than AI as we label it today, but it was transformative to our protection capabilities in a really consequential way. There will be these use cases out of this branch of the
Yep.
stuff we're talking about now. So even if it's overhyped and the wave hasn't quite formed yet, be prepared for the fact it could suddenly pump up and you need to catch it. And I think to that point, systems thinkers with a little familiarity with the technology a little statistical understanding, a little bit of a knowledge of LLMs, a little bit of a knowledge of machine learning, whilst they can't go write that AI or rip it apart, they'll understand the limitations and the benefits a little bit more than other members of the security team.
Yep.
So make sure you have a little bit of that expertise lying around and capacity, right? Security teams tend to run 100%. Think, do I want to get 5% ready to evaluate some of these use cases? Because to your point, Jeff, which I love, the stuff's getting deployed, with force majeure right now. So do I need to budget that in for 25? But Jeff, I mean, we'll get off AI soon because we could do do AI all the way through. I do want to ask you one more thing about AI though, because I think this is interesting. Of course, people are also looking to secure LLMs that are turning up in their environments. We've long promoted kind of secure by design, trying to shift left, thinking about building security in at the kind of architecture level. Any comments from you on how to think about securing AIs and associated technologies that turn up in our environments, or particular gotchas to watch out for kind of early on? Anything you'd kind of share with leaders there?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think right now there's a lot of concern around kind of securing the LLM itself. So securing the AI, securing the model. That's important. Don't get me wrong. But for the vast majority of organizations, you are probably not going to build a model, definitely not going to build a model. You're probably not going to train your own custom models from the ground up. You'll do some RAG, you might do some fine tuning. So you probably don't need to put that as your top priority. Instead, what you need to be thinking about is how you're going to grapple with this explosion of apps that use LLMs and third-party integrated LLMs into the products and services you already own. So thinking about that kind of AI proxy, AI firewall, secure AI ML system that your users are interacting with, or the apps that your users are interacting with that are underpinned by an LLM, that's really what you need to prioritize right now. And one of the other important things is not to approach this from just a security and control perspective. That's important too, don't get me wrong, but I think what makes a lot more sense is to look at it in this way. And this is what I walk security leaders through. The way that this is going to be used varies so much by department. A marketing team's use of LLMs and generative AI is so wildly different than a product team's or a development team's, et cetera, that you need to really sit down and look at it. Completely different, right? You've got to think about the department. You've got to think about the use cases within that department. And then you've got to sit down and think about the threats and the risks based on those two things. So a lot of times in security, we start with threats and risk because that's the world we live in. We've got to flip that around. And those have to be the last two things we think about. We've got to look at the department. We've got to look at the use cases, think about the threats and the risks. And then we come up with our security strategy of how we're going to add controls to this, how we're going to prevent, protect, detect, respond, investigate. All of those things come after that. So it's kind of like, don't rush to the control, rush to the use case in the department, because I can tell you, one thing that we see consistently is that using a Turing bot, using a coding assistant absolutely makes developers more productive. 20 to 30% more code generated by developers when they use those. It's awesome. That's huge. Except
one of the most obvious, provable, beneficial things you could do, right? Appeared as a use case early and everyone went, oh, that makes sense. And I tried it and went, that's pretty good.
It's good, right? But then you've got this concern because, well, as a security leader, when I tell you that you need to secure something, it's like, yeah, but then I tell you need to secure even more of it. Oh, okay, thanks. And then I tell you need to secure 30% more of it per developer, right? All of a sudden you're like, well, thanks. That was wonderful news. That was just what I was wondering today if I could have 30% more code per developer that I was responsible for making sure secure. Thanks for that. Well, that's happening. And so if you had a
and your budget's going up by the same amount, right?
And you had developers that didn't write secure code. Well, guess what? These Turing bots, they're not right. And these Turing bots are not adding secure code, right? Like we could fix software security forever if we just fix Stack Overflow, or Stack Exchange, but we can't always do that. There are concerns that we've got to sort of think about here and consider is, okay, well, if everyone's more productive, it exacerbates a problem that already existed. The same way that IoT security added a lot of sensors and a lot of data to your network. Well, you had to have visibility into that. Well, now we're going to have more code. So your software security, your DevSecOps, all of that kind of those internal things, they have to be better now. So that's what's starting to happen. And I think that's the challenge, but it's also a good opportunity. That's one of the benefits.
So look, I mean, AI's got some incredible use cases, of course, but it's also been pretty useful to the attackers, right? We've seen these stories circulating of amazing deep fakes being used in kind of deepening and broadening the approaches to fraud that the cyber criminals can take. So how do we think about, securing our environment with our users in a world where things are, less trustworthy? Do we just give up on security awareness and say, well, users are going to be duped, time to pack up on that one? Are there particular areas security leaders should focus more, given I think it's supportable humans are going to make more errors than before, given the ease and the quality of these types of deep fakes that Gen AI brings around?
Yeah, you're so correct about that, and it's one of those situations where one of my challenges with security awareness training in that market is that we have people that answer 100 or 200 emails a day, and then we expect them to kind of figure out the one that was the bad one, right? It's sort of it's a very difficult thing to sort of put the onus on the user or blame the victim in that way. And you're so right. I mean, one of the biggest advantages that adversaries have now with deepfakes in particular is that it is absolutely going to be easier to fool people. It just is, whether it's voice, whether it's video, whether it's audio. And one thing I want to stress here for security leaders to think about it from that user perspective is that it doesn't matter if it's true. It just matters if it's believable. And you have to think about that from a user perspective, right? It doesn't matter if it's true or real. It just has to matter does the user think it's believable? And is that going to trigger a behavior that's advantageous for the adversary? I think that is something to be really cognizant of. I think from an anti-fraud perspective, you've got to look at your technologies like biometric authentication, voice authentication, and others, and make sure that these capabilities are built into it. You're going to have to train your users even better. You're going to have to become more efficient and precise in terms of your processes and your governance, such that these things don't happen. It's rare that Forrester's CEO is ever going to text me and tell me that I need to buy gift cards. I know that. I'm a security person. I don't know if everyone knows that. I assume that George has a way to get gift cards if he needs them. I don't think he needs me to help, but not everyone knows that, right?
You could ask AI for some gift cards.
I could. You're right. I should go to one of the AIs and say, my CEO asked me about gift cards. Do I think the AI would say you can buy gift cards from here? Buy them now would probably be the answer I would get. So I think that's one. But the other part of this too is you're going to need, to your point earlier, you mentioned those fundamental and kind of foundational security initiatives, things like zero trust, for example. We're going to need to think about our environments and our segmentation and our architectures, because if we don't have things like zero trust deployed, then it means that when our user has access to one thing, they have access to everything. And if we agree, and I wholeheartedly agree, that it's going to be even easier to fool users in the future, it means that things like identity and access management, zero trust, training, security awareness training, all of those things, they're not less important. They become radically more important because we know they work. We know that these things are effective when done correctly. So if you haven't done them yet, and we know that it's going to be easier to fool users, you need to rush to play catch up on that, because you're taking effective controls and you're not leveraging them enough.
Yeah, I love that perspective. For me, you go to a very similar place on this. I think many security problems go back to this out of band validation, which is going to be a challenge with these developing AI capabilities. But I think all this is adding to the business cases for things we were working on, right?
Yep.
It's not that we're going to abandon having humans try to be sensors for attacks or trying to educate them, but we need to make sure they aren't the last line of defense. And MFA and kind of biometrics and things that create that moment of reflection or trust validation already mattered, and will do even more. But I love your pivot to zero trust here, because I got to be honest. I like to think of myself as a bit of a futurist. I've called a lot of things in this industry. I didn't think we'd be talking about zero trust in 2024. Or more specifically, I thought we might be talking about it academically. There's a lot of people running projects to fundamentally re-architect their networks, their applications, their business stacks. And I thought this was going to stay on the shelf as interesting idea that wouldn't get implemented. Were you caught off guard too, or did you have the perfect crystal ball on zero trust for 24?
I definitely don't. I don't want to say that I had the perfect crystal ball. Now, a little bit biased in the sense that from Forrester, right, with zero trust originating in a lot of our research and kind of being ahead on that topic, and frankly, even having some of the rest of the industry say like zero trust will never be real, even other research organizations and things
Right.
like that. I think
Called
I
it
think the most
academic.
interesting. It called it academic, exactly. So, and you know what? They weren't wrong at the time, right? If we go back and we look at that history of zero trust, at one point in time when Google was experimenting or implementing zero trust, they had to create, right? PhDs had to get together and write code to create systems that allowed them to deploy zero trust in a beyond corp sense, right? One of the first kind of large production deployments, and it took because the commercial market wasn't where we needed it to be. We didn't have zero trust edge, we didn't have zero trust network access, so we didn't have ZTNA, we didn't have ZTE. So the commercial situation wasn't really ready for this to be anything but academic, because if you've got to throw five super intelligent PhDs together to create an identity authentication system that you can deploy at production, yeah, the average manufacturing org probably shouldn't be focused on that. But as the
And
commercial,
the technology didn't plug together nicely.
that's
I know you could achieve it, but
absolutely.
let's be honest, it was like doing a triple indie backflip on a snowboard or something ridiculous. It was hard to
Yeah, I
get the
mean,
stuff to gel, and I think the pandemic helped us, right? The cloud acceleration, I think that really pushed this stuff on.
you're right about that. And the other part too is to your point about security, right? It's sort of like security didn't learn about middleware or APIs till about 30 years after the rest of technology. We finally got there. Finally, we're sort of there now. I don't know if we can fully say we're there, but we started
We could
understanding
spell
that.
it.
Yeah,
We
we
could
can.
spell
Yeah, we could programmatically interconnect systems. That seems like a marvelous idea. And the 90s called and they kind of want their middleware back. But luckily we're getting there now. But you're right, the architectures and the technologies and the management, the interfaces, nothing was conducive to doing this. And once the technologies really became ready for prime time and we could start deploying this, we had platforms, we had deployment models, we had a push to cloud, because that was the other part. Look, it's hard to retrofit anything. I mean, if you have an on premises network design, going back and re-architecting that to deploy zero trust, that's hard. But
seriously hard.
that's
A lot
hard.
of skilled work and a lot of work,
And
right?
a
But
ton
both
of
are
work.
true.
Yeah, and it's never easy to go back and renovate something, right? Building something new is always better and easier because you kind of start from scratch. Well, to your point about the pandemic and cloud kind of helping us with that, it did, because we had these cloud first initiatives, and so then we could start from a zero trust set of principles by being in the cloud first, and that made it.
And a lot of those architectures were built immutably. They were
Yep.
built with infrastructure as code. So even if their first deployments were very V1,
Right.
I actually see a lot of businesses right now doing their V2, V3 cloud deployment where they're like really learning what cloud is capable of,
Yep.
where their V1 was, oh my God, I need to get it out of the data center. Now
Yep.
they've like got cloud security engineers, they got like DevSecOps people on staff. But the way that stuff was built, turning on continuous authentication, authorization, logging, centralized control is much easier versus the traditional network, right? It's much more centrally configurable and updatable, let alone the kind of what people might be building next. I think that was massive. And the thing I failed to anticipate that makes zero trust sexy in 2024, I'm putting that on a t-shirt, by the way.
I like it. It'll be a big seller.
So hey, Jeff, I know we're running tight on time here. I got another topic on to hit, but before we do, zero trust. You hit on the fact it's a big change, right? It's a big undertaking for a business, but there's a lot of security leaders who are chewing on it. I talked to one person in manufacturing, big kind of 60,000 person organization, and they said, look, if we don't do it now, it's going to get worse.
Yep.
More data, more systems, more networks. I got to start. I'm digging the hole deeper. Top tips and things to think about. If you were giving 2 or 3 bullets of, hey, keep this in mind as you embark on, the zero trust journey. Anything in particular that you would call out to folks listening?
Yeah, and it was actually something that kind of surprised me. When we think about technology deployments, we often sort of think about the pilot program, start with the technologist, kind of do a slow rollout, right? Take your smallest part of the organization first, your smallest region, business unit, kind of eventually deploy it there, and then eventually roll it out to kind of everyone. And that's not bad. But one of the things that we kind of consistently have heard, because we did some research on common zero trust use cases, is that, well, it turns out that you can actually have a pretty enormous impact on user experience and employee experience by leveraging aspects of zero trust, especially as you make authentication easier. Using zero trust in a passwordless initiative, for example, as kind of a dual threat, if you will. I shouldn't say dual threat, but kind of a dual hit. That's huge, and it's really impactful.
Oh, come on, it's 2024. It's triple threat now.
Triple threat.
Quadruple threat.
Absolutely, right? And some AI, of course, AI enabled. We got to
the hyperbolic threats coming with added 4D AI.
All the threats are hyperbolic. I love that too. That's actually the T-shirt. But it's awesome, right? And so when you roll that out, you start to have this impact on users. So what we've actually seen a number of organizations doing is, instead of doing that slow roll kind of pilot thing, they'll actually go to a more active user base and roll this out and start getting some wins with that, and start to prove that, like, hey, we're making the organization more efficient here by streamlining authentication, by reducing permissions, reducing the number of apps, et cetera. And then that gets them kind of some momentum because they're making people more productive, and they can use that as a metric even. Hey, how long did it take someone to log on before versus now? Capture that, do an average amount of time, do that a little bit. You've suddenly got a business case. So one tip I'd mention is, don't just do this the way we've done every tech deployment ever. Don't be afraid of your users and the user experience. If you're actually making them more productive, that can help you build a lot of momentum for zero trust. You still got to be careful. You still have to do all the stuff you have to do, but don't be afraid to create some of that advocacy from your users and roll it out that way. And then this might carry across the rest of the org, because then all of a sudden every other leader is saying, well, I want logon to be, I've heard these other group, why did they get it first? That's the question you want to be asked, right? As a security leader, IT leader, why did this other group get that first? Well, because do you want it too? Okay.
I like that. We're gonna coin security transformation through jealousy as a new term.
Absolutely.
2024.
Right? Yeah. What's the thief of joy comparison? Well, make some of those execs in the enterprise compare. Take their joy, but get your stuff deployed. Yeah.
What a great security strategy. I know. I think that's really good advice. And look, I think for me, it ties up with something we've touched on in a bunch of other places. We're in the golden age of tools and technology options. You look at the average cloud platform, you wait 5 minutes, and Azure and AWS have probably released a new feature.
Yep.
There's new stuff all the time. We've got our security vendors adding new capabilities, new policies, throwing LLMs in. We got more stuff by an order of magnitude than we had 10 years ago or 20 years ago when I got started. And we don't have a lot more people.
Right.
Now, some of that stuff scales, but to do things like zero trust, to use the cloud effectively, even if you're consolidating vendors, you gotta have the people. And I don't think it's necessarily about 100 new folks. I think you have to have the right folks to figure out the policies and how to scale the technology, how to work with business partners on the principle of need to know and role definition to do what you just said. So for me, every security leader has got to be looking at their options on the shelf versus the army they've got to deploy to make the most of it. And I think most people are seeing some dissonance there. So think carefully about the kind of cyber capability plan for the next couple of years, because your options on technology are only going to grow out of pace with your ability to deploy them. And it's been that way for a while, I think.
It has. And one of the things that I often think about here is that, and I think about this in security operations in particular, but it spans every industry. I've heard this about identity as well. We have kind of this conundrum, right, where we hire folks, we train them up, but one of the risks that we have is that we create experts on a technology, but not experts on a methodology. So if I have an IAM expert, well, are they an IAM expert, or are they an IAM expert on the product of IAM that we happen to use? Because if they are, that may not translate very well to another technology. It's true in security operations. Have we trained someone to be a really good security operations person that understands deductive reasoning and methodologies and investigative methodologies and evidence? Or have we trained them on a particular EDR tool in a particular query language? And unfortunately, I think we've done a lot more of that than we intended to, because to your point, we depend on these technologies. That's how we accomplish a lot of things. So we've got to take a step back and we've got to think about the way that we train personnel being less vendor specific and more methodology specific, so that they understand the principles.
That's a great point.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I love how you phrase that. It's kind of the how to task versus how to think.
absolutely.
And of course, learning how to do the thing with a particular vendor technology is important, but the framework for the goal, the business impact, the problem, the understanding of the threat, the technology ecosystem, that's a foundational base of knowledge that, builds a security team where the sum of the parts is greater,
Yep.
than the whole. I really like that way of thinking about it. And I do think a lot of teams have slipped a little too far sometimes into the task, not the thing, or the vendor, not the framework. That's a good point. And not
And it
not
makes it
trivial
hard.
to fix quickly. It does, yeah. Particularly if you've
Because it
got
makes it
multiple technologies in that environment too.
right. And it makes it hard to swap those out. So suddenly you find yourself kind of making that devil's bargain of like, well, we don't love this product, but all our people know how to use it. And we don't know if the other products are that much better. So inertia sets in and you just stick with the thing that maybe you're not happy with. And I think that's one of the real concerns about it. But it also affects you from a succession planning perspective and just an upskilling perspective, because it becomes much harder to upskill someone when you're so focused on the technology and not those other capabilities. Because, well, is someone being really, really great and having mastery of a technology platform, does that make them a great leader? No. But, someone that's an effective communicator, well, that helps them be a really effective leader. So do you have to, have you spent all your time training someone on interfaces when you should have been training them on a human interface, right? That ability to communicate and talk. And so that's where some of those skills become so important, not just the technology ones for the method, but also how are you identifying your next crop of leaders? And is the person being the best at an EDR tool or an IAM tool? Does that mean that they're going to be a great manager? It generally doesn't. So we need to upskill in different ways and start that succession planning, which means we've got to reduce our reliance on the tech competency a little bit, and shift it into some areas that matter.
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal point. And look, I'm seeing a way more structured approach to how people think about the skills of their team, technical and business and social, than I've ever seen before. Right? I think we're growing up as a profession.
Yeah.
And I'm being purposeful in that. What do I need to engage with the broader business? Back to AI right up front. What do I need to evaluate these technologies and figure out if they're useful? And I think a lot of security teams are quite busy fighting rearguard action, kind of, squashbuckling behind them with the technologies that have been deployed, that they're stuck into. Because I don't run into security teams that are running at less than 105% capacity. Yep. There's always stuff to do. There's always an event to investigate. There's always an incident. And so creating that space to be able to investigate the what next, creating the space to think about automation, deployment of AI, what the business need is crucial.
Yeah.
And this sounds so obvious, but doing it in the pressure vice, the first thing we talked about,
yep,
business, technology, threat, regulation, etc., is incredibly difficult. But look, hey, I know we're at time here. I'm going to wrap this up, but I'm going to give you one last chance here. One chance to be prophetic and brilliant, Jeff. Not that you haven't been through the rest of the talk, but one thought, 30 seconds of closeout for security leaders as they tackle the next couple of years, aside from go check out your research, download the SANS white papers on this stuff, all the kind of other content. That aside, one thing you'd have security leaders pay particular attention to, what would it be?
So the thing I'll say is security is not a cost center. We have a lot of security leaders that think that security is now a profit center. You've got cyber insurers, you've got regulators, you've got customer requirements, you've got partner and supplier requirements that all demand that you have a certain base level of security. And all of those things are responsible for your enterprise generating revenue. So you may not think that you are generating profit and revenue for your business, but as a security leader, you are absolutely at the epicenter of its profit strategy from here on out in that trust intersection you talked about earlier. that is something that I would leave security leaders with: is don't let yourself think that you're a cost center. You are a profit center. And that's my prophecy, that that's going to become a bigger deal than it is even now. And that's that CISO's chance to really prove that they are permanently ensconced and should be in the C-suite where they fought to be.
I love that point. Look, I agree with you. That role is established, and I think it's growing. I think it's growing at the societal level. I think it's growing at the business level. And to those of you thinking, hey, there's increased personal liability here, do I belong in this industry? To the point that was just made, it may be risky, it may be challenging. There are easier jobs. I can't think of a more important place that will shape the future of technology and business practice than this role. And I think it's worth the risk. So I hope you can apply some of the practices Jeff and I talked about, make some time to step back, think about the strategy, the evolution of your team makeup over the next couple of years, create the capacity to evaluate, not just be a passenger on the journey of this stuff, like trying to actively catch the wave. And of course, Jeff, you and I'll have to do 17 more of these to cover the litany of other topics we didn't cover today. But I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts, your ongoing work and research here. I'm sure it will, save a few security leaders reading 20 dense white papers, getting the consolidated version. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope we could do this again soon. I really enjoyed it.
It was awesome. Look forward to it.
Until next time, and good luck everyone deploying AIs in every single imaginable tool, good, bad, and ugly, and convincing them not to hallucinate at all. What could go wrong?